Soldier bullies an old woman, but Roman Reigns rushed to save her. In a quiet town, an old woman is relentlessly bullied by a young soldier who believes he can get away with anything, until a chance encounter with a legendary figure changes everything. When Roman Reigns, the famous wrestler, steps in to confront the bully, he's about to uncover something deeper than he expected. Will the soldier continue his ruthless ways, or will this unexpected intervention force him to confront his own hidden pain and guilt? Watch the full video to discover. If this is your first time here on our channel, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on our amazing stories. Now, let's jump into the full story. In a quiet, sleepy town nestled among the hills, Mrs. Walker lived a simple life. At 82 years old, her days were spent tending to her garden, taking strolls through the town, and remembering the many years that had come and gone. However, her peaceful life had recently been disrupted by a young soldier named Jason. Jason was stationed at the nearby military base, and when he first arrived, he was just another face in the crowd. But over time, his behavior became more troubling. The once polite young man had begun to show a disturbing side. Jason had taken a liking to bullying Mrs. Walker. He would pass by her house every day and taunt her with harsh words and cruel laughter. Sometimes, he'd go as far as to knock over her gardening tools or toss her mail onto the street. Mrs. Walker, though old, wasn't easily frightened, but the constant harassment wore her down. Every time she saw Jason, her heart sank, knowing what was coming next. The townspeople had seen it all, but no one dared to step in. Jason wore his uniform like a shield, and the people of the town were too afraid of his position to confront him. Mrs. Walker felt alone in the world, but she didn't show it. She kept her head high, walking to the market every day, though she now dreaded the trips. Jason's taunts were getting louder, more frequent, and Mrs. Walker wasn't sure how much longer she could take it. Little did she know, help was about to come from the most unlikely of places. Jason didn't have a reason for his cruelty. He wasn't a bad person by nature, at least, not at first. But the longer he spent in the military, the more hardened he became. The constant pressure to prove himself, to be stronger and tougher than everyone around him, made him bitter. Mrs. Walker, with her frailty and age, became an easy target. She represented everything he despised: weakness, vulnerability, and he could never stand to see others appear weak. One chilly afternoon, as Mrs. Walker made her way to the local market, she struggled with a heavy cart. She was carefully navigating the cobblestone streets when Jason spotted her. Without any warning, he rushed over and shoved the cart to the side, causing the contents to spill. A loaf of bread tumbled to the ground, and a jar of jam shattered. Mrs. Walker gasped in shock and tried to gather the broken pieces, but Jason only laughed. "Pathetic," he sneered. "Can't even carry a cart without breaking it." His mocking tone echoed through the street as Mrs. Walker struggled to regain her composure. The small crowd that had gathered stood frozen, unsure of what to do. They knew Jason was dangerous. No one dared to confront him. But Mrs. Walker had had enough. "Leave me be, boy," she said, her voice weak but firm. "You have no right to treat me this way." Jason only laughed harder, taking a step closer. He wasn't going to let her get the best of him. Just as the situation seemed to escalate, a voice rang out from behind them. Roman Reigns had just finished his charity event and was visiting the town for some well-deserved rest. Known for his imposing presence in the ring, Roman had become a household name not just for his wrestling but also for his charitable works. He had heard about the town and its tight-knit community, and it seemed like the perfect place for a quiet getaway. As Roman walked through the streets, he couldn't help but notice a commotion near Mrs. Walker's house. A few onlookers had gathered, but no one was stepping in to help. His instincts kicked in as he walked closer, his massive frame drawing attention. The first thing he noticed was the old woman struggling to pick up her cart and the young soldier looming over her, his words sharp and mocking. Without hesitation, Roman moved toward them, his large figure casting a shadow over Jason. The crowd fell silent as the infamous wrestler approached. Roman's reputation had preceded him, and even Jason knew who he was. He turned slowly, sizing up the man who had entered the scene. "What's going on here?" Roman asked, his voice steady and authoritative. Jason sneered but didn't back down. Just minding my business, hero, Jason retorted. This lady seems to think she can push me around. But I'm not scared of some old woman. Roman's gaze hardened. It's not about being scared, kid. It's about respect. With every word, Roman's presence became even more imposing. The crowd watched in silence, waiting to see how the situation would unfold. Roman's towering frame blocked Jason's view of Mrs. Walker, who stood in stunned silence. The soldier looked up at the wrestler, his bravado faltering just for a moment. Jason had picked on people like Mrs. Walker for so long that he had forgotten what real strength looked like. Now, standing face to face with Roman Reigns, he felt a surge of unease. What are you going to do? Jason spat, trying to mask his nervousness with aggression. Think you can intimidate me just because you're a wrestler? He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to regain control of the situation. But deep down, Jason knew he was out of his depth. Roman didn't flinch. I'm not here to fight you, kid, he said, his voice calm but firm. I'm here to show you that picking on someone weaker than you isn't strength. It's just cowardice. Jason scoffed. Oh, please. What do you know about real strength? You're just a showman. He took a step forward, his chest puffing up with false confidence. Roman didn't move. Strength isn't about putting others down. It's about lifting them up. His words hit Jason like a physical blow, but Jason wasn't ready to back down. You don't know anything about me, Jason growled. He was desperate to hold on to his image of toughness, even though the cracks were starting to show. Mrs. Walker watched from behind Roman, her heart racing. She had never seen anyone stand up to Jason before. Would this man's words make a difference, or would the soldier's anger escalate? The tension in the air was palpable as Roman Reigns and Jason locked eyes, neither willing to back down. The crowd, which had been whispering among themselves, stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Walker, standing behind Roman, clutched her coat tightly, her hands trembling. She had been the victim of Jason's cruelty for so long, and for the first time, she saw someone willing to stand up for her. But would it be enough to break through the soldier's hardened exterior? Jason's gaze flickered briefly, as if questioning his own stance. But his pride quickly surged back to the surface. What do you think you're going to do, huh? You're just some guy, some wrestler, Jason sneered, trying to mask his uncertainty with arrogance. I've been through more than you'll ever understand. You don't know me. Roman, unfazed by the soldier's words, took a slow step forward. His massive presence seemed to swallow up the space between them, and the crowd instinctively took a step back, sensing the growing intensity. I don't need to know everything about you, Jason. What I do know is that no one, especially an old woman, deserves to be treated like this. You want to be strong? Show some respect. Stand up for something that matters. The words hung in the air. Jason's breath hitched for a moment, but his stubbornness flared up again. He was used to being in control, and this confrontation was rattling him. He took another step forward, glaring at Roman. You can't just come in here and tell me how to live my life. Roman didn't flinch. I'm not telling you how to live it. I'm just showing you what real strength looks like. The words hit Jason harder than he expected. Roman's unwavering stance made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't felt before. His fists clenched at his sides, but his resolve began to waver. It was strange. The more Roman spoke, the more Jason found himself questioning everything he had built up in his mind. For years, he had used bullying as a way to feel in control, to feel powerful. But now, in front of this man, his facade was crumbling. Roman saw the conflict in Jason's eyes and softened his tone. You don't have to hide behind this act, Roman said, his voice low and calm. I've seen it before. People who push others down because they don't know how to deal with their own pain. Jason stepped back, shaking his head. What would you know about me? You think you can just look at me and figure me out? You don't know anything. But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction. Roman took another step closer, his presence still overwhelming. I don't need to know everything, but I can see you're hurting. You're trying to mask it by being tough, but deep down, you're angry. Angry at what? At the world? At yourself? Jason's jaw tightened. He wanted to deny it, to fight back, but he couldn't. The truth was, Roman was right. His life had been full of pressure and expectation. His father had raised him to believe that emotions were weakness, that strength was defined by how much you could endure without breaking. Jason had buried his own hurt so deep that he didn't know how to deal with it anymore. Jason's thoughts began to unravel, and his mind drifted back to his childhood. He remembered the harsh words of his father, a stern military man who had demanded perfection. There was no room for failure in their home. Every mistake was met with punishment, every tear seen as a sign of weakness. "Don't cry," his father would say. "Boys don't cry. If you want to be a man, you have to act like one. Strong, tough, no excuses." As a young boy, Jason had wanted nothing more than to please his father. He worked hard to excel in everything he did, but it was never enough. Nothing ever seemed good enough to earn his father's approval. Eventually, Jason learned to suppress his emotions entirely. He became numb to pain, convinced that showing any sign of vulnerability would make him weak in the eyes of those around him. The memories flooded back, one after another. The shouting matches, the cold stares, the constant pressure to be perfect. Jason realized, with a sinking feeling in his chest, that he had spent his whole life trying to live up to an ideal that didn't even make sense. He wasn't trying to be strong for himself. He was trying to prove to everyone else that he wasn't weak. But in the process, he had become exactly what he despised. Someone who pushed others down to lift himself up. His breathing grew heavier, and he turned away, unable to face Roman, the guilt rising in his chest like a tidal wave. Roman stood silently as Jason's turmoil became more apparent. The soldier's shoulders hunched, his back turned to Roman, and for a moment, the wrestler thought Jason might walk away. But then, slowly, Jason spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be different." Roman took a step closer, his voice full of quiet encouragement. "You don't have to fix it all in one day, Jason. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's about making the choice to start." Jason shook his head, still unsure. "But I've hurt so many people. I've hurt her." His eyes drifted back to Mrs. Walker, who had been watching them silently from the sidelines. Her face was full of compassion, not anger, which made Jason feel even worse. How could he face her after everything he had done? Roman could see the internal battle that raged within him. You can't change the past, but you can change the future. The first step is to admit what you've done wrong and own it. You can't change who you were, but you can decide who you're going to be from now on. Jason swallowed hard, his throat tight. The weight of Roman's words pressed down on him, but for the first time in a long while, Jason felt something shift inside him. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he didn't have to be the angry, bitter person he had been. Maybe, just maybe, he could become better. Mrs. Walker, who had been standing quietly behind Roman, stepped forward slowly. She had seen the battle within Jason, the way his tough exterior had cracked, and she knew this moment was crucial. Jason had the chance to change, but it would take more than Roman's words to heal the wounds he had inflicted on himself. "Jason," Mrs. Walker called softly, her voice full of kindness. "I've lived a long life, and I've seen a lot. But one thing I've learned is that it's never too late to change. We all make mistakes. It's part of being human. What matters is how we choose to learn from them." Jason looked at her, his face a mixture of shame and disbelief. "You're not angry at me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head. "I've known pain, young man, but I also know that holding on to anger only weighs you down. I've forgiven many people in my life, and I'm not going to hold your past against you. What matters now is what you do next." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jason felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he could change. Maybe he could make amends for the pain he had caused. But first, he needed to apologize to the people he had hurt, starting with Mrs. Walker. With a deep breath, Jason stepped toward her. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I never should have treated you the way I did. I was wrong." Mrs. Walker smiled gently, a warmth in her eyes. "It's a good start," she said softly. Jason spent the rest of the evening in deep reflection. He wandered through the streets, his thoughts swirling as he replayed the events of the day. Mrs. Walker's forgiveness was something he hadn't expected. For so long, He had convinced himself that people like her were weak, but now he saw the strength it took to forgive someone like him. As night fell, Jason found himself standing at the edge of the town, looking out at the stars. He thought about his father, the man who had shaped him into what he had become. He had tried so hard to meet his father's expectations, but in doing so, he had lost sight of who he really was. Jason had become the person he had been taught to be, not the person he wanted to be. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been living for others, trying to prove something that didn't matter. But now, he had a choice. He could start living for himself. The weight of his past was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden. For the first time in years, Jason felt a glimmer of peace. It wasn't too late to make things right, and he was determined to try. The days following his confrontation with Roman and Mrs. Walker were a whirlwind of reflection for Jason. Though he had made the decision to change, the weight of his past mistakes still lingered. As he walked through the town, he couldn't help but replay every moment he had spent tormenting Mrs. Walker. The guilt gnawed at him, but he also felt something new: determination. He was ready to make things right. Jason began to realize that the bullying wasn't just an act of aggression. It was a cry for help. He had buried his pain for years, convincing himself that showing any vulnerability made him weak. But now, he understood that the weakness wasn't in admitting pain. It was in refusing to face it. One quiet afternoon, as Jason sat alone in his small apartment, he thought back to his time in the military. He remembered the intense training, the endless drills, and the relentless pressure to be strong, to be perfect. But beneath it all, there was a secret that he had never shared with anyone. He was terrified. The military had always been his escape from a world where he felt out of place, but it also kept him locked in a cage of his own making. Jason's fear was not of failure, but of being seen for who he really was. Behind the tough exterior, he was just a man trying to survive in a world that didn't always make sense. The truth was, he was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of showing weakness. And that fear had led him to hurt others, including Mrs. Walker. But now, as he sat there, Jason made a silent vow to himself. He would no longer hide from the truth. The following morning, Jason decided it was time to face his past, starting with his family. He hadn't spoken to his father in years, not since he'd left for the military. Jason had always felt as if he couldn't live up to his father's expectations. The older man's cold, unapproachable demeanor had left him with a deep sense of inadequacy, and over time, their relationship had fractured beyond repair. But now, Jason understood something he hadn't before. His father's harshness wasn't necessarily a reflection of his love for him. It was a product of his own unresolved issues, his own fears. Maybe, just maybe, his father had been afraid of showing weakness, too. It was time to find out the truth. With a deep breath, Jason dialed his father's number, the one he hadn't dialed in years. The phone rang for what felt like an eternity before his father answered. "Hello?" His father's voice sounded gruff, but there was a tinge of something unfamiliar in it. "Dad," Jason said, his voice shaky but determined. "It's me, Jason." There was a long pause on the other end. Jason's heart raced. "I know it's been a while," he continued, "but I've been thinking a lot about the past. About how we never really talked." His father's voice softened. "What do you want, Jason?" "I think it's time we had that talk," Jason replied, taking a deep breath. Roman had gone back to his routine after the event in the small town, but something about it stayed with him. The way Jason had reacted, the way he had softened in front of him, struck a chord in Roman. He was no stranger to redemption. He'd fought battles in the ring and in life. But there was something different about Jason's struggle. Roman decided to check in on the young soldier. He didn't know exactly what Jason had planned for his future, but he felt that he couldn't just walk away. He had helped Jason take the first step, but the journey was just beginning. It was time to see how he was doing. When Roman returned to the town, he walked past Mrs. Walker's house again. This time, however, there was no sign of Jason's usual bravado. Instead, Roman noticed him standing near the community center, speaking with some of the local kids, offering advice, and helping where he could. Roman's presence didn't go unnoticed. Jason looked up and saw him approaching. His face broke into a small, almost sheepish smile. "Roman," he said, a sense of respect in his voice that wasn't there before. "I didn't expect you to come back." Roman grinned. "You think I'd leave after seeing that?" he said, nodding toward the kids. "You're doing good, man." Jason's smile faded slightly. "I'm trying. I don't know if I can fix everything, but I'm trying." Roman placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's all anyone can ask. Just keep going." Jason spent the next few weeks slowly rebuilding his relationships with the townspeople. He began volunteering at the local community center, helping the kids with their studies and organizing charity events. Slowly, the people who had once feared him started to see the man he was becoming, not the soldier he had once been. The hardest part of his journey, however, was facing the people he had hurt the most, like Mrs. Walker. One afternoon, as he helped her pick up her groceries, Jason stopped, his heart heavy with regret. "Mrs. Walker," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I owe you an apology. For everything. For the way I treated you. For the insults, the bullying. I was wrong." Mrs. Walker turned to him, her expression warm but serious. "I've forgiven you already, Jason," she said, her voice gentle. "It takes a lot of courage to admit your mistakes. But what matters now is what you do next." Jason nodded, taking in her words. "I'm going to do better. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want to show you that I've changed." She smiled, a faint twinkle in her eye. "That's all I need to see." For the first time in years, Jason felt as if he was on the right path. He had a long way to go, but the road ahead was no longer a burden. It was an opportunity. Jason woke up early the next morning, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders, but not in the way he once had. There was a new sense of purpose in his life. His days of hiding behind anger and arrogance were behind him. He had a new mission: to rebuild the bridges he had burned and to prove that strength came from kindness, humility, and resilience. As he walked through the town, he saw Mrs. Walker sitting on her porch, waving at him with a friendly smile. Roman had been right. There was strength in forgiveness, and Mrs. Walker had been the living example of that strength. Jason nodded at her and continued on his way to the community center. Today, he was going to mentor the local kids, teaching them not just about schoolwork, but about life, about respect, and about choosing to be better. With every step, Jason felt the weight of his past grow lighter. He wasn't running from who he used to be anymore. Instead, he was embracing who he was becoming. The old Jason, the bully, the soldier, was gone, and in his place stood a man ready to make amends and start fresh. As Jason continued to work hard on his personal transformation, the community began to take notice. The change in him was undeniable. Where he once walked with arrogance and hostility, he now moved with humility and a newfound kindness. He worked alongside the local children, helping them with homework and participating in community cleanup days. Slowly but surely, the people who had once been afraid of him started to see the man he was becoming. One day, as he was organizing a neighborhood event to help raise funds for the local library, Jason noticed the town's residents beginning to show signs of appreciation. A few families who had once kept their distance now greeted him warmly, offering thanks for his efforts. Some even stopped to chat, sharing their own stories of struggle and redemption. Jason smiled at the small but significant changes around him. It wasn't just about the work he was doing, it was about the relationships he was building. People were seeing him for who he truly was, not the soldier who had once bullied an old woman. And that meant more to him than anything else. One afternoon, as Jason was helping a young girl carry her books home from the event, she looked up at him and said, "I'm glad you're helping us. You've been so kind lately." The words struck Jason deeply. He realized that he had already started to earn the trust and respect of the community. There was still work to be done, but the fact that the people around him were beginning to see the change in him was all the confirmation he needed to keep going. Jason had learned many things in the past few weeks. The most important lesson, however, was about the power of forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but forgiving himself. For years, he had carried the weight of his past mistakes, believing that his actions defined who he was. But now, he understood that while the past shaped him, it did not have to dictate his future. He had spent so much time hating himself for the things he had done. But now he knew that in order to truly move forward, he needed to forgive himself. This wasn't about forgetting what he had done, but about accepting it and learning from it. One evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, Jason reflected on his journey. It had been a difficult road, but it had also been one of the most rewarding. The people in the town were beginning to see him differently, and so was he. He had started to see his own value, not in the way he was perceived by others, but in the way he treated himself and those around him. As he thought about his relationship with his father, Jason realized that the forgiveness he had extended to others, he needed to offer himself as well. He had been carrying around guilt and anger for so long, and it was time to let it go. With a deep breath, Jason made a promise to himself. He would continue to strive for growth and change, not because anyone expected it from him, but because he deserved it. Jason's transformation didn't go unnoticed, not just by the people in the town, but by the people who had heard about him from afar. The local news had caught wind of the changes he was making in the community, and soon, the town's story of redemption was shared on social media. People from other towns reached out, eager to hear more about the soldier-turned-volunteer. Jason was invited to speak at a local event about his journey, and while he had always been a man of few words, he found himself eager to share his story. That evening, he stood before a crowd of people, his hands slightly shaking, but his heart full of gratitude. "Some of you might remember the old me," Jason began. "The soldier who thought he had all the answers, the guy who tried to prove he was tough by hurting others. But that wasn't me. It was the mask I wore to hide my pain. And I'm here to tell you that it's okay to take off the mask." His words resonated with the audience, and as he spoke, Jason realized that his journey had come full circle. He wasn't just helping the community, he was inspiring it. The very people he had once hurt were now looking up to him, seeing him as someone who had overcome his past and was now using his strength for good. Jason's story wasn't just one of personal redemption. It had become a beacon of hope for others who were struggling. He had shown them that it was never too late to change, and that even the darkest past could lead to a brighter future. The weeks that followed were full of new opportunities for Jason. He continued to volunteer, helping at community events, organizing charity drives, and spending time mentoring the young people in town. His relationship with the townspeople deepened, and more people began to trust him. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jason himself. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. He had stopped trying to live up to the expectations placed on him by his father and by society. He had learned to trust himself, to believe in his own worth, and to understand that true strength came from within. One afternoon, as Jason walked through the town square, he ran into Mrs. Walker again. She was sitting on a bench, enjoying the sunshine, and when she saw him, she waved with a warm smile. Jason stopped and sat next to her. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he said quietly, "about how it's never too late to change. I think I've really started to understand that." Mrs. Walker looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and understanding. "You've come a long way, Jason, and I'm proud of you. But the journey's not over yet. Keep walking the path you're on." Jason nodded, a feeling of peace washing over him. For the first time, he wasn't afraid of the future. He knew that no matter what challenges came his way, he had the strength to face them, because he had already faced his greatest challenge, himself. As the sun set over the town, Jason stood outside the community center, looking out at the people walking by. It had been a long and difficult journey, but he had finally come to terms with his past. The bitterness and anger that had once consumed him had faded, replaced by a sense of purpose and self-respect. Jason knew there would be more obstacles ahead, more moments of doubt and fear. But he also knew that he had the tools to overcome them. He had learned that strength didn't come from dominating others or hiding his feelings. It came from facing his weaknesses and working to become better every day. Roman Reigns had taught him that true strength wasn't about physical power, but about the courage to change. And Mrs. Walker had shown him that forgiveness was the key to healing. Jason had learned to forgive himself, to accept his mistakes, and to move forward with a heart full of hope. The town had witnessed his transformation, but the most important part of his journey was the transformation he had made within himself. As he looked out at the people around him, Jason realized that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a never-ending journey, and he was ready for whatever came next.